On the morning of January 17, 1968, two men in stained work coveralls knocked on the service entrance of the Iraqi embassy in Beirut, carrying toolboxes and a length of copper pipe. The Lebanese security guard barely glanced at them before waving them through. He'd been told plumbers were coming to fix a leak in the third-floor bathroom. What he didn't know was that these weren't plumbers, they were Mossad operatives, and hidden inside those toolboxes were cameras, lockpicks, and detailed floor plans of every room in the building. By the time the sun set that evening, they would photograph classified Iraqi military documents that would change the course of the Six-Day War and expose Soviet military advisors operating throughout the Middle East. But getting to those documents and getting out alive would require something far more difficult than breaking into an embassy. It would require them to maintain their cover while working alongside actual embassy staff for an entire day, never breaking character, never showing the slightest hesitation, all while photographing some of the most sensitive intelligence Israel had ever targeted. This is the story of Operation Matchbox, one of the most audacious intelligence operations in Mossad's history, and it begins not in Beirut, but in a cramped apartment in Tel Aviv 6 months earlier, where a young intelligence officer named David Kimchi was staring at a problem that seemed impossible to solve. David Kimchi had joined Mossad in 1953, right after completing his military service. By 1967, at age 34, he'd risen to become Deputy Chief of the Operations Division, the branch responsible for planning and executing intelligence-gathering missions in hostile territory. Kimchi was known within Mossad for two things: his methodical approach to problem-solving and his willingness to consider operational plans that others dismissed as too risky or too creative. In July 1967, just weeks after the Six-Day War had ended, Kimchi received a priority intelligence requirement from the Directorate. Israeli military intelligence needed information about Iraqi military capabilities, specifically whether Iraq was planning to deploy forces to the Jordanian border and what role Soviet military advisors were playing in Iraqi military planning. Iraq had participated in the Six-Day War, sending a mechanized brigade to support Jordanian forces, but Israeli intelligence knew very little about Iraq's actual military readiness or its strategic intentions. The problem was access. Iraq had no diplomatic relations with Israel. Israeli intelligence officers couldn't operate openly in Baghdad. The Iraqi government was closely aligned with the Soviet Union, making it difficult for Mossad to recruit sources within the Iraqi military or government.
And Iraq's embassy network throughout the Middle East was heavily secured, with personnel vetted by Iraqi intelligence and buildings protected by local security services that were often hostile to Israeli interests. But there was one potential vulnerability: the Iraqi embassy in Beirut. Lebanon in 1967 was a strange political environment, caught between competing interests and maintaining a delicate balance between various factions. The Lebanese government officially supported Arab causes, but Beirut itself was cosmopolitan, open, and relatively permissive compared to other Arab capitals. Western intelligence services operated freely, Palestinian groups maintained offices, and the city's commercial districts were full of foreigners who attracted little attention or suspicion. The Iraqi embassy sat in the Hamra district, a busy commercial neighborhood in West Beirut. It was a 4-story building, unremarkable from the outside, with offices occupying the upper 3 floors and a ground floor that housed administrative functions and a small consular section. Lebanese security guards monitored the main entrance, but the building also had a service entrance used by maintenance workers, delivery personnel, and embassy staff arriving through the back alley. Israeli intelligence had been monitoring the embassy since 1965, photographing everyone who entered and exited, documenting the daily routines, identifying staff members through facial recognition, and cross-referencing with known Iraqi diplomatic and intelligence personnel. What they'd learned was that the embassy's security was competent but not exceptional. Documents were stored in a secure room on the 3rd floor, a room that required a key held by the ambassador and the chief of security. But the building's physical security, the doors, the locks, the alarm system, was standard commercial grade, not the hardened infrastructure you'd find at a Soviet or American embassy. Kimchi began developing an operational plan in August 1967. The core concept was simple in theory but extremely complex in execution. Get Israeli operatives inside the embassy during normal business hours, when the building was occupied and active, giving them access to the secure room while maintaining a plausible reason for being there that wouldn't trigger suspicion from embassy staff or security personnel. The idea of posing as maintenance workers had been used before in espionage operations, but usually for quick access, getting in and out within minutes. What Kimche was proposing was different. His operatives would need to spend hours inside the building, moving through multiple floors, working alongside Iraqi staff members, maintaining their cover story while secretly photographing documents, and then extracting themselves without anyone realizing that anything unusual had occurred.
The plan required precise intelligence about the building's layout, its maintenance schedules, its security procedures, and most importantly, when and how legitimate contractors accessed the building for repairs. Over the next 3 months, Mossad surveillance teams in Beirut gathered that intelligence. The surveillance operation itself was complex and required multiple operatives working in shifts. A photography shop across the street from the embassy became an observation post, rented under a cover identity and staffed by agents who documented everyone entering and exiting the building. The photographers maintained logs with timestamps, noting the arrival and departure of embassy staff, the delivery schedules for mail and supplies, and crucially, the patterns of maintenance workers servicing the building. They observed that contractors typically arrive between 9 and 10:30 in the morning, usually through the service entrance, and that the Lebanese security guards rarely conducted thorough searches of toolboxes or equipment. This was a critical vulnerability. The guards seemed to rely on advance notice from the building superintendent rather than implementing strict screening procedures. Mossad also needed detailed information about the interior layout. Standard architectural plans for the building were obtained through contacts in Beirut's Municipal Records Office, but these plans didn't show recent modifications or the specific configuration of embassy offices. To solve this problem, Mossad recruited a Lebanese electrician who had worked in the building 6 months earlier. The electrician, who had no idea he was providing information to Israeli intelligence, was approached by what he believed was a competing construction firm interested in bidding for future maintenance contracts. Over dinner and drinks, he described the building's layout in detail, mentioned the secure room on the 3rd floor, and explained the embassy's general security procedures based on what he'd observed during his work there. They photographed the service entrance, noting what times delivery trucks and maintenance workers typically arrived. They identified the building superintendent who managed maintenance requests, a Lebanese man named Rashid Halawi, who worked for the building's owner, not for the Iraqi government. They learned through a well-placed source that the 3rd floor bathroom had been experiencing intermittent plumbing problems, water pressure issues, and occasional leaks that required periodic repairs. In October 1967, an opportunity emerged. The superintendent, Rashid Halawi, was overheard during a phone conversation arranging for a plumber to come fix a persistent leak in the 3rd floor bathroom. The repair was scheduled for the following week. This was exactly the opening Mossad needed, but it presented a new problem.
How do you substitute your own people for the plumbers without alerting the actual plumbing company or the superintendent who arranged the service? The solution came from a Mossad operative in Beirut who had been building cover as a small business owner. His name was Rafi Madan, and he'd been living in Beirut for 2 years under the identity of a Palestinian businessman who imported construction supplies. Through his business contacts, Madan knew many of the Lebanese contractors who worked throughout the city, including the plumbing company that serviced buildings in the Hamra district. Madan approached the plumbing company's owner with a proposal. He had a wealthy client who needed emergency plumbing work done at a private residence on the same day the Iraqi embassy job was scheduled. He offered to pay triple the normal rate if the company would postpone the embassy job by 1 day and send their crew to his client's residence instead. The plumbing company agreed. They called the building superintendent and explained that they needed to reschedule the embassy repair due to a staffing issue. Could they come the following day instead? The superintendent, annoyed but not suspicious, agreed. Now Mossad had a 24-hour window. They knew when the plumbers were supposed to arrive. They knew the superintendent would be expecting them. And they knew that if their operatives showed up at the right time, in the right uniforms, with the right tools, they'd be waved through without extensive questioning because everyone involved believed legitimate contractors were coming to fix a legitimate problem. Kimchi selected 2 operatives for the mission. The first was a man named Yosef Cohen, one of Mossad's most experienced field agents who had conducted operations throughout the Arab world. Cohen spoke fluent Arabic with a Lebanese accent and had spent months preparing for undercover roles that required sustained interaction with targets. The second operative was a technical specialist named Shlomo Iraqi, whose expertise was breaking into secured spaces and bypassing locks and alarm systems. Both men spent weeks preparing for their roles as plumbers. They studied plumbing techniques, practiced using actual tools, learned the terminology that Lebanese contractors would use, and rehearsed the specific repair they claimed they'd be performing, fixing a leak in a bathroom on the 3rd floor. The training took place at a Mossad facility outside Tel Aviv, where a mock bathroom had been constructed to match the specifications of the embassy's third-floor facilities. Cohen and Iraqi practiced the complete operation dozens of times, timing each phase, identifying potential problems, and developing contingency plans for various scenarios. What if embassy staff asked detailed technical questions about the plumbing work? What if they were asked to fix additional problems beyond the original leak?
What if security procedures were more stringent than intelligence reports suggested? Each scenario was rehearsed until their responses became automatic. They also studied Iraqi culture and Lebanese business practices extensively. They needed to understand not just how to speak Arabic, but how Lebanese contractors interacted with building superintendents, what kind of small talk was expected, how to negotiate payment, even how to complain about traffic or weather in ways that would seem natural and unrehearsed. The psychology of cover work is complex. It's not enough to memorize a false identity or learn technical skills. An operative must inhabit the role completely, thinking and reacting as that person would think and react, because any hesitation, any momentary break in character can trigger suspicion. Mossad's training programs emphasize this total immersion. Cohen spent 2 weeks working alongside an actual Lebanese plumber in Tel Aviv who had immigrated to Israel years earlier, learning the physical rhythms of the work, how a plumber moves and carries tools, the small habits and mannerisms that distinguish someone who does this work every day from someone who's merely pretending. They obtained authentic work coveralls from a Lebanese plumbing company, slightly stained and worn to look legitimate. They acquired toolboxes identical to those used by Beirut contractors and filled them with actual plumbing supplies, pipes, wrenches, sealant, everything you'd expect to see in a working plumber's kit. Hidden among these legitimate tools were the items they'd actually need: a miniature camera designed for document photography, lock-picking equipment disguised as plumbing tools, a small drill for creating access to locked doors, and a hand-drawn floor plan of the embassy's third floor showing the location of the secure room where intelligence reports indicated classified documents were stored. On January 16, 1968, Cohen and Iraqi entered Lebanon through the Beirut airport using false passports that identified them as Lebanese nationals. They were met by Rafi Madan, who provided them with a safe house in the Akrafia neighborhood and went over the final operational details. The next morning, at exactly 9:30, they would arrive at the Iraqi embassy's service entrance. The building superintendent would be expecting plumbers. The Lebanese security guard would have been told contractors were coming. Everything would appear routine and normal. But once inside, they would have approximately 6 hours to locate the secure room, bypass its lock, photograph as many documents as possible, return everything to its original position, and exit the building without arousing any suspicion. If anything went wrong, if their cover was blown, if embassy security realized they weren't actual plumbers, they'd be trapped inside a hostile facility with no easy escape route.
Kim Che, overseeing the operation from Tel Aviv, had made it clear that if they were caught, Israel would deny any knowledge of the operation. There would be no diplomatic rescue, no prisoner exchange. They'd be on their own. On the morning of January 17th, Cohen and Iraqi left the safe house at 8:45, dressed in their work coveralls and carrying their toolboxes. They drove a rented van through Beirut's morning traffic, arriving at the Iraqi embassy at precisely 9:28. The building looked exactly as it had in surveillance photographs, a nondescript 4-story structure with a Lebanese flag and an Iraqi flag hanging above the main entrance. They parked in the alley behind the building and approached the service entrance. A Lebanese security guard in a dark suit stood just inside the door. Cohen knocked, and when the guard opened the door, Cohen spoke in Arabic. They were here to fix the leak on the 3rd floor, the bathroom that had been causing problems. The guard nodded, checked a clipboard, and made a phone call. After a brief conversation in Arabic, he hung up and gestured for them to enter. The superintendent was on his way down to show them where the problem was. Cohen and Iraqi stepped inside, and for the first time, they were operating inside an Iraqi government facility. The interior of the embassy was busy with morning activity. Staff members moved through hallways carrying folders and briefcases. Somewhere on an upper floor, phones were ringing. The smell of Arabic coffee drifted from what was probably a break room. Everything looked and sounded like a normal office building at the start of a workday. A middle-aged man in casual clothes appeared at the end of the hallway. Rashid Halawi, the building superintendent. He looked tired and slightly irritated as he approached. He spoke to Cohen in Arabic, asking if they were from the plumbing company. Cohen confirmed that they were, apologized for the delay in scheduling, and asked to be shown the problem. Halawi led them to the stairway, complaining as they climbed about how the building's plumbing was constantly causing issues, how the embassy staff blamed him for every problem, even though the building's systems were old and poorly maintained.
Cohen nodded sympathetically, making appropriate responses, establishing rapport the way a contractor would with a building superintendent who controlled future work opportunities. They reached the third floor, and Halawi led them down a hallway lined with closed office doors. Near the end of the hall, he stopped at a bathroom door and pushed it open. The bathroom was small, just a toilet, a sink, and a mirror. The floor showed signs of water damage near the base of the toilet. Halawi pointed to the area and explained that water had been leaking intermittently for weeks, that previous contractors had supposedly fixed it, but the problem kept recurring. Cohen crouched down, examined the area, and made a show of inspecting the pipes.
He told Halawi that they'd need to shut off the water to this section of the building, probably for a couple of hours while they replaced some fittings and resealed the connections. Halawi sighed, said that would be fine, just try not to cause more problems. Then he left them to their work and headed back downstairs. Cohen and Iraqi were alone on the third floor. They closed the bathroom door and immediately assessed their situation. According to the floor plan hidden in their toolbox, the secure room was 3 doors down from the bathroom on the same side of the hallway. But they couldn't simply walk out of the bathroom and start picking locks. Embassy staff were moving through the building, and the hallway had windows that looked out over the street, meaning anyone glancing up from the street below might see movement. They needed to be methodical, cautious, and completely aware of their surroundings at all times. Iraqi actually began working on the bathroom plumbing, creating the sounds of legitimate repair work, wrenches clanking against pipes, water running briefly as he tested connections. Meanwhile, Cohen cracked the bathroom door and observed the hallway. Over the next 20 minutes, he documented the pattern of movement. Staff members passed by every few minutes, some entering offices, some heading to the stairwell, everyone appearing absorbed in their own tasks and paying no attention to the closed bathroom door. At 10:45, there was a lull in hallway traffic. Cohen signaled to Iraqi. They gathered their critical tools, the camera and lockpicks, and stepped out of the bathroom with Iraqi carrying a winch prominently, as if checking connections in the hallway. They walked purposefully toward the door they believed was the secure room. When they reached it, Cohen tried the handle, locked as expected. The door had a standard pin tumbler lock, commercial grade but not exceptional. Iraqi set down his toolbox, positioned himself to block the view from the hallway, and began working on the lock. The technique he used took less than 90 seconds, manipulating the pins with picks disguised as small screwdrivers. The lock turned and the door opened. They stepped inside quickly and closed the door behind them. The room was exactly what Israeli intelligence had hoped to find. Filing cabinets lined 2 walls. A desk sat near the window with stacks of folders arranged in neat piles. The documents were in Arabic and many more stamps indicating classification levels: restricted, confidential, secret. This was the embassy's secure storage area for sensitive communications and intelligence reports. Cohen immediately began photographing. The camera he carried was a specially designed Minox, small enough to conceal in one hand, capable of capturing clear images of documents under low-light conditions.
He worked systematically, opening filing cabinet drawers, selecting documents that appeared most relevant based on keywords visible in the Arabic text, laying them flat on the desk, and photographing each page. Iraqi stood by the door, listening for footsteps in the hallway, ready to signal if anyone approached. The minutes stretched with agonizing slowness. Every sound from outside the room, voices, footsteps, phones ringing, seemed amplified and threatening. At one point, approximately 20 minutes into their work, someone knocked on the door. Both operatives froze. Cohen quickly returned the documents he'd been photographing to their original location and moved away from the desk. Iraqi positioned himself near the filing cabinet as if examining something. Another knock. A voice speaking Arabic from the hallway, asking if anyone was in there. Cohen made a decision. He opened the door slightly and looked out. A young Iraqi man in a suit stood in the hallway holding a folder. He looked confused, asked who they were and what they were doing in a restricted office. Cohen responded in Arabic, explaining that they were the plumbers working on the bathroom leak, that they needed to check the pipes behind the wall in this room because water damage was spreading. He gestured vaguely toward the wall near the filing cabinets. The man looked uncertain. He said this was a secure office, that contractors weren't supposed to be in here without authorization. Cohen apologized, said the building superintendent had told them to check wherever the leak might be spreading, but if this room was restricted, they could come back later after getting proper approval. The exchange was critical. If the man decided to report the incident to security, if he insisted on staying in the room while they worked, if he became suspicious about their real purpose, the operation would be compromised. But Cohen's demeanor was perfect, respectful but slightly annoyed, exactly how a Lebanese contractor would respond to unexpected bureaucracy while trying to do his job. The man hesitated, then said they should speak with the security officer before going into restricted areas. He would go get authorization. He turned and walked toward the stairway. Cohen and Iraqi had approximately 3 minutes, maybe less, before the man returned with security. They couldn't continue photographing documents. The risk was too high. But they also couldn't simply leave empty-handed. Cohen made a snap decision. He grabbed the folder from the desk, the one that had been sitting in the most prominent position, suggesting it was current and important. He opened it briefly, saw that it contained what appeared to be military briefing documents with dates from the previous month. He quickly photographed the first 5 pages, returned the folder to its exact position, and signaled to Iraqi. They exited the room, closing the door behind them and ensuring it was locked.
Then they walked back to the bathroom, entered it, and resumed their plumbing work. Approximately 4 minutes later, footsteps approached in the hallway. The bathroom door opened, and the Iraqi man from before appeared, along with a Lebanese security guard. The security guard asked to see their identification and their work order. Cohen produced a falsified work order that Mossad had prepared, showing authorization from the building superintendent to repair plumbing issues on the 3rd floor. The security guard examined it, asked a few questions about what specifically they were fixing, then seemed satisfied. He told them to complete their work and leave the building without entering any restricted areas. They assured him they would. The guard left with the Iraqi staff member. Cohen and Iraqi remained in the bathroom for another hour, actually completing some plumbing repairs to maintain the appearance of legitimate work. During that time, they could hear increased activity in the hallway, more voices, more movement, as if the embassy staff had become more alert. At 1:15, they packed up their tools, including the camera now loaded with photographed documents, and emerged from the bathroom. The hallway was busy with staff members, several of whom glanced at the 2 plumbers without apparent interest. Cohen found the building superintendent on the 2nd floor, reported that the leak had been repaired, and collected payment in cash as Lebanese contractors typically did. The superintendent thanked them and showed them to the service entrance. At 1:32, Cohen and Iraqi walked out of the Iraqi embassy, climbed into their van, and drove away through Beirut's afternoon traffic. The operation had lasted just under 4 hours. They'd been inside a hostile facility, maintained their cover under direct questioning, photographed classified documents, and extracted themselves without triggering any serious security response. But they wouldn't know if the operation was truly successful until the film was developed and analysts could assess what intelligence they'd captured. They returned to the safe house, handed the camera to Rafi Madan, who would courier it to Tel Aviv, and then disappeared into separate cover identities. Cohen left Lebanon that evening on a flight to Paris. Iraqi departed 2 days later through Damascus using a different passport. Neither man would return to Beirut for several years. The film arrived in Tel Aviv on January 19th and was immediately sent to Mossad's Intelligence Analysis Division. What they found exceeded expectations. The documents Cohen had photographed in that brief time inside the secure room contained detailed information about Iraqi military deployments along the Jordanian border, including unit designations, equipment inventories, and operational plans. The analysts worked through the night, translating the Iraqi documents and cross-referencing the information with existing intelligence holdings.
What emerged was a comprehensive picture of Iraqi military intentions that Israeli commanders had been seeking for months. One document was particularly significant. It was a memorandum dated January 8, 1968, from an Iraqi military commander to the Ministry of Defense in Baghdad, outlining a proposed deployment of 2 mechanized brigades to positions near the Jordanian border. The memorandum referenced consultations with Soviet military advisors who had apparently recommended specific positioning and logistics based on their analysis of Israeli defensive capabilities. This confirmed what Israeli intelligence had suspected but couldn't prove, that Soviet advisors were directly involved in operational planning against Israel, not just providing equipment and training. Another set of documents revealed details about a shipment of Soviet T-55 tanks scheduled to arrive at the port of Basra in March 1968, along with technical specifications and maintenance requirements. This intelligence would allow Israeli military planners to understand the capabilities of equipment they might face in future conflicts. There were also communications between the Iraqi embassy in Beirut and Baghdad discussing intelligence gathering efforts against Israeli targets in Lebanon. These documents mentioned Palestinian groups operating in refugee camps near Beirut and suggested that Iraqi intelligence was coordinating with these groups to collect information about Israeli activities in southern Lebanon. This information was immediately shared with Israeli military units operating near the Lebanese border. But perhaps the most valuable aspect of the intelligence wasn't any single document, but rather the cumulative picture it provided of how Iraqi military planning operated, what kinds of information were considered important enough to store in embassy secure rooms, and how communications between field commands and central authorities were structured. This kind of insight into an adversary's decision-making processes and organizational culture was exactly what intelligence services sought, because it allowed analysts to make better predictions about future actions and to identify patterns that might indicate preparations for military operations.
But perhaps most valuable were the insights the operation provided about Iraqi embassy security procedures and the vulnerabilities in how Arab governments protected sensitive information in overseas facilities. Mossad's operational planners conducted an extensive after-action review, documenting what had worked and what could have gone wrong. The review highlighted several key factors. First, the maintenance cover had been perfect. Embassy staff expected contractors, and as long as workers appeared professional with plausible authorization, they attracted minimal scrutiny. Second, conducting the operation during business hours when the building was busy actually reduced suspicion.
Third, actually performing plumbing repairs maintained the cover effectively. The review also identified several moments when the operation could have failed. The encounter with the Iraqi staff member in the secure room had been the most dangerous. If that man had been more suspicious or immediately called security, the operatives would have had very limited options. The contingency plan had been to abandon the mission and extract themselves quickly, claiming confusion about authorized access. Another critical factor was the quality of the false documentation. The work order Cohen presented had been professionally forged using authentic forms obtained through Mossad contacts in Beirut's construction industry. If it had appeared suspicious, the operation would have failed immediately. The operation's success led to a series of similar missions throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, as Mossad replicated the methodology at other Arab embassies and government facilities. Not all of these operations were successful, and the methodology evolved based on lessons learned from both successes and failures. The operation remained classified for decades. David Kimchi would go on to become one of Mossad's most senior officers, serving as deputy director from 1980 to 1982, and later as director general of the Israeli Foreign Ministry. He occasionally alluded to operations from the late 1960s, but never discussed Operation Matchbox by name. Yosef Cohen, the lead operative in the embassy operation, continued working for Mossad throughout the 1970s under various cover identities. He left the service in 1981 and settled in Jerusalem, where he lived quietly until his death in 2003. Shlomo Areli, the technical specialist, left Mossad in 1975 to work in private security consulting. Neither man ever spoke publicly about their intelligence careers, maintaining operational security until the end of their lives. The Iraqi embassy in Beirut continued to function normally, apparently never realizing that Israeli operatives had penetrated their secure room and photographed classified military documents. It wasn't until years later, after multiple similar operations had been conducted by various intelligence services, that Iraqi security officials began implementing more stringent protective measures. In 1972, following several security incidents at Arab embassies, the Iraqi government implemented new protocols, requiring multiple layers of authorization for contractors and mandatory escorts for maintenance workers. But these measures came too late to prevent the breach that had occurred in Beirut 4 years earlier. The intelligence gathered during Operation Matchbox continued to provide value for years. The insights into Soviet military advisory relationships informed Israeli strategic planning, and when war broke out in 1973, Israeli commanders had a clear understanding of how Soviet advisors influenced Arab military planning. The methodology pioneered in this operation became standard in intelligence tradecraft. By the 1980s, embassy security procedures worldwide had evolved to counter this threat, with stringent vetting of contractors and mandatory security escorts. The story of Operation Matchbox represents a particular approach to intelligence gathering that defined much of Mossad's operational philosophy during this era. Rather than relying on technical surveillance or recruited sources, which could be detected or compromised, the operation used human operatives in close proximity to targets, relying on careful preparation, attention to detail, and the ability to maintain cover under pressure. The risks were enormous. If Cohen and Areli had been caught inside that embassy, they would likely have been tortured for information about Israeli intelligence operations, then either executed or held as prisoners for potential exchange. The diplomatic consequences would have been severe, potentially triggering military responses or escalating tensions throughout the region. But the intelligence gathered justified those risks in the calculation of Israeli security officials, who believed that understanding Iraqi military capabilities and Soviet involvement in Arab military planning was essential to Israel's survival. In the decades since, similar operations have been conducted by intelligence services around the world, though few have been acknowledged publicly. The basic methodology, gaining access through cover identities, exploiting routine maintenance or service appointments, photographing documents quickly, and extracting without detection, has become a standard approach in human intelligence operations. What made Operation Matchbox particularly notable was not just its success, but the audacity of spending hours inside a hostile facility while maintaining a cover that required continuous performance and interaction with targets who could have exposed the operation at any moment. The two men who knocked on the Iraqi embassy service entrance that morning in January 1968 were carrying toolboxes and wearing stained coveralls, looking like exactly what they claimed to be, Lebanese plumbers hired to fix a leak.
That was the genius of the operation. The best cover isn't an elaborate story or a complex identity. It's something so mundane, so ordinary, so expected that no one thinks to question it. Everyone knows that buildings have plumbing problems. Everyone knows that maintenance workers need access to fix those problems. And in that gap between what people expect to see and what's actually happening, intelligence officers can operate with remarkable effectiveness, hiding in plain sight while gathering secrets that would otherwise remain forever out of reach. So now you know how a leaking bathroom and 2 men with wrenches became the key to one of Israel's most successful intelligence operations.
The story of how Mossad agents posed as plumbers, walked into the Iraqi embassy in Beirut, and walked out with military secrets that would shape the Middle East for years to come. And if you found this story fascinating, if you want to hear more incredible true stories about espionage, covert operations, and the hidden history of the Cold War, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. Drop a comment below telling us what you think about this operation, and let us know what other intelligence stories you'd like us to cover. Because the world of espionage is full of operations just as audacious as this one, stories that have never been told publicly, secrets that are only now coming to light decades after they occurred. And we're here to bring those stories to you, one operation at a time.